Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're very excited to have you join us from both across Australia and across the world. And thanks for staying awake for those who are joining us from overseas. First of all, if I can just get my slides to work, I am going to pay our respects to the traditional custodians throughout Australia. Those are the elders past, present and emerging. And we want to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play in our community. And today I'm joining you from the land of the Gimoy in Far North Queensland. Again, thank you for joining us all today. And for those that haven't met me, my name is Beryl Morris and I'm the Director of TERN, Australia's Ecosystem Observatory. And people often ask me what TERN is when I say that. We're a national research infrastructure project funded by the Australian government. And what we do is make all the observations and data collections that tell us about what's changing in the environment. We also collect physical samples and we develop all sorts of tools and apps and things like that that help researchers studying ecosystems of both land and coastal ecosystems to work out a deeper understanding of what is happening, magnitude of change and direction of change. When we say infrastructure, we mean our people and our instruments and the data. They're all covered under the definition of infrastructure. So we're recording today and we will be sending out our recording to people. Because some people have registered and have notified us that they actually can't make the time, but want to catch up later. And it's now my great pleasure to be able to introduce the speakers that we're having today. I'm just going to tell you very briefly something about each one, and they're on the screen in the order in which they will appear. And I'm only going to say a few things because you've got the bios that we've already sent out when you registered. Our first speaker is Gab Abramovitz, who is Professor in the Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. And he'll be followed by Professor David Noon, who's from the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And then from CSIRO Environment, we have Ashok Lua, who's the Senior Principal Research Scientist. And then anchoring the whole lot, we have Professor Claire Murphy from the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Life Sciences at the University of Wollongong. If you run into any technical difficulties, please put that in the chat. But if you want to ask questions as you listen to the speakers, please choose the Q&A button so that we can track it a little bit better. Now, I'm going to ask Gab to turn on his camera so that he can lead us off, and I'll catch up with you all a little bit later. So, Gab.
Thanks, Beryl. I'm just going to share a screen. How's that looking? Right. Okay, so please let me know if you can't see or can't hear me, but I'm going to attempt today to talk to you about why I think ecosystem process measurements are critical for understanding climate change impacts. And that might seem like a bit of a long bow to draw, but bear with me and we'll see how we go. I want to start sort of with the community that I spend a lot of my time with, and that's climate modelling and the evolution of climate models. And these are two very old figures now from the IPCC third assessment report. That's the UN body charged with synthesizing climate research. But these two figures are still pretty much true today. And that is what I want to point out here is that climate models are essentially made up of component models that started with the atmosphere and moved on to the atmosphere and land surface. And eventually lots of other things got brought in together with that. And that is ongoing. This is an old figure and many more things have been added, but the basic structure is still the same. They're made up of these component models. And over time, the resolution of these models has, of course, increased in terms of the spatial resolution and the temporal resolution that they run at. And that has needed more and more supercomputing power as time has gone on. Now, some things haven't changed. And in particular, that the way these modules work together is they are still separate pieces of code and they still exchange information through things that we typically call couplers, but it's very much the same kind of process. So the atmosphere model will send wind and radiation and meteorology to the ocean model. The ocean model will send back sea surface temperature, heating, carbon fluxes. Similarly to the land will get the meteorology information from the atmosphere, and the atmosphere model will get evapotranspiration, heating, and carbon fluxes back from the land. And these are just examples. Obviously, all of those other spheres also have these kinds of exchanges. And this is not just a one-way coupling. Obviously, the things like stream flow nutrients from the land end up in the ocean as well. But all of those spheres have this kind of relationship. And so when we're trying to work out whether climate models are working well, we might think it's a really simple job to just take real-world measurements and compare them with the output of a climate model and say, do they agree? Is the climate model working? But if you want to know a little bit more about why, that's not so simple at all. So, for example, if I get a temperature measurement and it does not agree with real-world measurements, that might be the atmospheric model, but it might not be the atmospheric model because the temperatures it's getting from the ocean might be wrong, or the evapotranspiration or heating it's getting from the land might be wrong. So when you get a disagreement, it can be very, very hard to tell what has caused the problem because the temperature that you're measuring is actually the result, sort of an emergent result of many, many, many processes. So picking it apart can be very hard. So if they don't agree, it's very hard to tell why. And if they do agree, it may not actually be for the right reason, which makes it doubly confusing. So the key takeaway here is that results are always conditional upon other parts of the modeling system. And if you're interested in that, there's a rather fun paper, if you'd like to read it, from a journal you've probably never thought to look at, Studies in History and Philosophy of Modern Physics, but I really do recommend it if that sort of thing is of interest. So what do we actually do? How do we get at what is going on here? Well, if I take the land as an example, what we really want to do is isolate these spheres of the modeling system and say, can I find observations of the radiation, the temperature, the rainfall, the meteorology going into the land surface, and the things that it's producing separate of the rest of the system to try and understand whether it's playing its role well. And I'm choosing the land here as an example because a lot of the climate impacts that we're interested in agriculture and flooding and forestry and fire, carbon sequestration, water resources, and more, are very much bound up in these land models. So although the atmosphere and the ocean are kind of the engines of the climate and they are really driving what's going on, where the rubber hits the road in terms of the impact is very much in this land space. It's where we live. And the nature of those impacts is very much determined in future projections by the way these land models behave. So constraining their behavior is quite an important thing if we want to know what's going to happen. And ideally, if I want to break down what a land model looks like a little bit more, I would like to think about a land model as just a function, a mathematical function that has some inputs and has some outputs. And like I said before, it's primarily driven by the meteorology from the atmosphere, but there are also things like surface properties, so soil properties, vegetation properties, that are typically in grids across the land surface are also given to this function. And the outputs are the things that we talked about that we might be interested in addition to fluxes to the atmosphere. Here are the sort of hydrological things that might cause flooding or be important for water resources in blue, the vegetation properties that might feed into agriculture, and obviously fire is quite self-explanatory. Now, if I'm going to evaluate how this model works by itself, the most obvious way to do it perhaps would be an analog to the way it works in the coupled climate model environment to try and do a simulation of a land model over a large region. And I want to, although this is sort of the ideal situation, I want to talk to you about why this is actually a very difficult thing to do. To get the meteorology that we need to drive a land model over a region like this, typically requires something called a reanalysis product, which is something like the output of a weather forecast model. And the uncertainty in those driving variables, and we're talking about radiation and temperature and humidity and precipitation, is typically not particularly well known or quantified. So I put a little question mark here over, is this correct? So if we're trying to work out whether this land model part is right, are the inputs right? Similarly, the parameter information, the surface properties, are also reasonably poorly constrained in this gridded environment. We usually prescribe them with things called vegetation and soil types. So a land model would have lots of internal parameters. And if we can only give it one piece of information about vegetation and one piece of information about soil that prescribes the rest of those, you can imagine there's quite a lot of uncertainty. Similarly, the evaluation products at those gridded scales are also not particularly well constrained. And the timescales that we do this evaluation at ends up being monthly, because a lot of the gridded evaluation products that look at things like land surface fluxes into the atmosphere are derived from things like satellites that have limited numbers of overpasses. And so the time step size ends up being quite coarse. So when we do this comparison and we get a mismatch between observations and the model, it's not really clear whether the model is at fault or it's the driving data. And this is, as you are probably realizing, very similar to the situation we're in when we're looking at the climate model as a whole. And this, in my mind, is where the land surface flux data comes in. So flux towers, and these really are towers like you see in those pictures. They are scaffolding towers or towers of some sort with a collection of instruments on top that measure a lot of these things that we're interested in. And the scale is not ideal. Typically, the fetch of these towers is about a square kilometre or less, but there are some really compelling advantages to the data that we get from these towers. They provide in situ measurement of the driving data and the thing we're trying to evaluate for the land models. They have the same time step size as the land models. So instead of having to look at the emergent properties of a land model's predictions through many iterations, we can really look at a land model as a single function, as single executions of that function. Many of the vegetation and soil parameters can be directly measured. The carbon stores are often measured, and the uncertainties, therefore, can be relatively well quantified. And over the Earth's surface, we have hundreds of these sites, millions of actual observations, so we have large sample size. So what that means is we can do some really interesting things. And this is just an example of the kinds of games we can play, which I think makes this quite a lot more interesting than looking at gridded simulations. We can use empirical models such as regression or machine learning to predict the fluxes from the meteorological variables, just like the land model is doing. They can tell us how much information meteorology has about the fluxes, so we can develop a proxy for the predictability of fluxes in particular environments. We can use empirical models then to benchmark these land surface models, so we can understand a priori, meaning before we run them, how well we should expect them to perform. And by varying the setup of the empirical models, we can test how we test them out of sample. We can create a hierarchy of performance expectations for the land models by varying things like which variables we give the empirical models as predictors, how many of those meteorological variables they can have, the time location, the location and the time period that we train versus test the empirical models on, how complicated the empirical models are, and whether we allow lagged variables for proxies as for model states. So we might allow lagged rainfall, for example, as an input to the empirical models, or just allow machine learning models with internal model states. So what this allows us to do is to have differing performance expectations depending on the complexity of the environment and the conditions of the environment at that particular point in time. And that allows us to have a very sophisticated and nuanced approach to understanding whether our models are performing well in those environments. So the last point I want to make is that we are trying to set up an automated system that actually puts all of this into practice. So that involves taking flux tower data from TERN ecosystem processes, putting that through an automated pipeline that does quality control and formatting specifically for use in models. And in return, and that feeds into this platform that we have, modelevaluation.org. It's a web application. In turn, users will get back from that analyses of their site data, actual feedback from modelers about what they have seen in their data and what might be wrong with their data or right with their data and what they've learned from it. And that can be in the form of a wiki or obviously direct communication as well. This project is authored together with the Access NRI, that's the Australian Community Climate and Earth System Simulator, and that is our bridge to all of the climate and weather modelers that use land models in Australia, essentially. So the idea is we have a system now that is provenance controlled both on the data side and the modeling side, and we get automated model evaluation that ties all these things together and allows communication across these different spheres. And all of this is run on the national computational infrastructure, so we manage to get fast model results and fast evaluation back to users. So last slide. Just to sum up what I've said. So while the atmosphere and ocean are the engines of climate, a lot of the impacts that we're interested in, particularly on human systems, depend on land models. Flux tower sites offer us the best constraint for land models, and so are key to improving our understanding of these impacts in my view. Using flux tower data together with machine learning can help us understand when land model simulations are good enough to be useful and when they're not, and also help us understand how we might improve them. And we're building a system to put all of this into practice. So if any of that stuff is of interest, there's a paper that came out recently comparing about 20 land surface models across the globe from different institutes in this kind of a framework. If you're interested in, please take a look. But otherwise, I'm now going to hand over to David Noom.
Great. Thanks very much, Gab.
Yep.
And thanks all for coming along, and thanks too for Beryl for organising this session. I'm going to take an approach here where starting to think about some of the challenges of using information at site scale. And please, somebody make a little noise if you're not seeing my screen there. And thinking about some of the challenges which we might really be coming to that are connected to the water cycle. And I'm thinking here very specifically about some of the challenges over the next decades and centuries regarding how in Australia, particularly being an arid environment, but other places too, we might choose to utilize water on our landscapes. And there's a variety of things we can do with the limited resource of water that we have. Certainly things like crops or investing in maintaining nature-based solutions, perhaps finding ways to optimize carbon uptake through use of either planted crops or forestry or regrowing indigenous vegetation for different ways to meet our carbon targets as well. All of those things require water as sort of the fundamental lifeblood of the climate system. So when we think about the exchange of water and energy and carbon between the landscape and other areas, we're really thinking about this connected system, as Gab had mentioned there, the connections between the ocean, where most of the water is, the atmosphere, the land surface, the ice sheets, even if we go that far, it's all connected. So I really want to talk today a little bit about some of the synthesis between those components and the requirement that there is agreement between them. And we need some new insights in how we do this. And I'll talk specifically about one technique that we're making use of. Just for some inspiration, here is a figure showing trends in evapotranspiration. This is not a particularly recent paper. There's other examples out there. It shows that both the demand and the actual trends in evapotranspiration are increasing. So there's a tendency for water to be removed from the land surface if the colors here are blue, and less removal if there's red. So you can see across Australia, for the most part, the demand for evaporation and actual evaporation is going up as well. So with that sort of context in mind, we might start to think about, well, do we have models that can help us with this? And exactly as we've just heard, that surface-based measurements are really quite essential to helping both validate, improve, and really inspire next generations of models. But the state of play is not particularly good. There are a variety of models. Modelling centres have their own models. There's several in Australia. And I'll note particularly the access system has both Jules and Cable as two different types of models within that system. There are numerous other land surfaces models as well. And I would say for the most part, there's quite a deal of disagreement between them in a number of areas. This diagram here is one example. We happen to be involved in a study over the Amazon that this was particularly useful for us to think about. This shows 3 different models looking at, in the dark green there, transpiration, and the middle color green, I suppose, that's actually the yellow one I want to focus on, is the evaporation. And then the other place that rainfall can go is into drainage. So for both forest and pasture lands, each of these 3 models depict how rainfall is distributed between these different places that rain can go once it goes onto the landscape. Does it come back to the atmosphere as transpiration? Does it come as evaporation? Or does it go deeper into the soil and go to some sort of drainage runoff? What you should note is that the 3 models, they have some degree of similarity, but they're certainly not the same. And in fact, other ways that we can look at this actually show that these differences are quite substantial. It's important to note for changes or differences in the way that water is utilized is really a fundamental statement about the distribution of energy, that energy is associated with the way in which water would evaporate, for instance. So there's some challenges here in how we may evaluate this. We can ask the question, where does the water actually go? Where does the rainfall actually go? And how might we model this? Here's the depiction of a remarkably simplified version of these types of models where we might imagine rainfall coming in and becomes distributed in some sort of calculation and eventually comes back as transpiration or runoff or something like that. So if we think about the complications of these sorts of models, we're really challenged to think about how water can be parameterized or described to go between these different reservoirs in the landscape, soil, perhaps snow, or in the vegetation itself. So that's the challenge that we've been working on. And the way we've been attacking this is by thinking about using the stable isotope composition of water to help us do this. And this is really based around two complementary ideas. The first idea is that if we could put a dye, I think, of a color, perhaps if we changed all the precipitation to be blue water, as we put it into the land surface, we could then track it to see how it moves through the system. Then if we could measure then the color of the water throughout our ecosystem, either in reality or a computer representation of this digital representation, we'd get some idea of how the water is moving through the system. This is coupled to the other idea that actually there's naturally occurring colors, and that is that the water comes in several flavors. Regular old water is H2O, but sometimes the hydrogen is replaced by deuterium, a stable isotope. And actually, that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. There's another flavor where the oxygen has 2 extra neutrons, so it's O18. But for today, I want to talk mostly about this HDO molecule as one of the natural flavors for water in the ecosystems or in nature as a whole. And the way we want to proceed here is to use the same idea that it turns out that when water is removed from the soil by transpiration, it carries with it the flavor or the color of the water in the soil. The isotope ratio doesn't change. But during evaporation, because there's a phase change involved at the evaporation point, the isotope ratio changes. That difference gives rise to a measurable and then a useful signal that we can both measure and then make use of to infer how water is moving through the system. Does water go back to the atmosphere as transpiration, or does it come back as evaporation? We can use these measurements to differentiate those two and thereby test our models. So that's the idea. Over the last, well, actually, I should say decade, actually, we've been involved in TERN's sibling infrastructure system, NEON in the US, the United States Ecological Observing Network. And there's sites around the US that make measurements on the flux towers similar to TERN, but they also include the stable isotope ratios. So we've undertaken a program to actually calibrate and prepare the observations and then use those observations of the stable isotope ratios to get at this idea of what is the isotope ratio of the transpiration fluxes and the evapotranspiration fluxes as part of a way that we're addressing these questions of the model performance, but more fundamentally, of course, what's actually happening in nature as well. So a diagram here just showing that here are the tower locations where these measurements have been made, and we can effectively identify the color of the water that's coming back to the atmosphere. We can use that to infer how water is moving through the landscape. Now, of course, we might like to continue making use of these towers, but in the idea of synthesis, we can also use information from other sources. I wanted to highlight actually, it's a constellation of satellites that are used for both research and operational weather purposes that have capabilities that allow them to make measurements of the stable isotope ratios of water vapor from space. And a couple of these are operational. Relatively recently, down the bottom right there, MEDOP SG2, second generation European spacecraft, has a shiny new instrument, which we're looking forward to seeing new observations shortly. But it should be astounding to everybody, as it is to me, that there's a remarkable investment in satellite remote sensing capable of making stable isotope measurements, and it's been vastly underutilized. To give you an idea, I've put together a little diagram here showing on the left the amount of water in the atmosphere, and on the right-hand side, the panels showing the hydrogen deuterium to hydrogen isotope ratio on the right-hand side. This is really quite a phenomenal amount of data that's here. It's really quite unprecedented. What we're looking at here is a global spatial resolution of about 5 kilometers for the stable isotope ratios. And you can see in the case of the mountain ranges here, it's detecting the changes in elevation, which we'd expect. The other thing I really wanted to point out is if you notice the difference in the upper panel being wintertime June, July, August, and the bottom panel showing December, January, February, there's a very fundamental shift in the flavor of water, the color of water. In this case, it's literally color on the diagram, but it's really saying that the type of water we have is different between those different seasons. It's just telling us the water is originating from different places for the most part. The way it's moving into the continent through atmospheric motions is quite different. So that's sort of a bit of a teaser really there, that this is the essence, the essential measurable signal that we can make use of to get some inference about the way the water moving through these systems. So how do we actually do this? Let's have a look at an example. Well, we start with our satellite observations. That's great. Actually, it could be any observations. In this case, it happens to be satellite observations. And we wish to make use of a sufficiently complicated model to really start thinking about getting at the problems that we want to solve. And so they're often not the same thing. The model we're using is helpful to get us to the answers we want, but the answers themselves are not the model in the same way the data itself is not the answer, but it's really helping to come together in a synthesis mode to get to the new knowledge. So in this particular example, we did a global analysis to try and identify how how long water resides in different aspects of the ecosystem, and in particular, the degree to which water in soils are connected to the atmosphere, either through fast return times or slow return times, as we might expect for groundwater systems. So using this approach and using the stable isotope ratios, we're able to effectively take our model and then infer what the residence time for water in different pools would be is to give us a global result. And these numbers are the ones that we wanted to deduce. So what I've done, just to put this back in context from where we started, is you'll see on this diagram, these numbers are the results, but I want to pull out a couple of highlights and bring that back to where we started. Recalling this diagram, it happens to be from the Amazon, but in fact, this approach would work everywhere. We could use the information that we've done through this synthesis of satellite observations to put new constraints on not which one of these models is correct, but what is a different way of identifying the target for what the model should be trying to do. So the equivalent metrics here are the ones that we have derived. The percentage of rainfall here, we deduced 47% of the rainfall should return as transpiration, and summing, actually, these are cumulative. So at the 74% mark would where we should be for the total amount of evapotranspiration returning into the atmosphere. So you could suggest that, well, perhaps this model is doing pretty well for native vegetation, but the pastures that have replaced the forests, maybe it's not doing so well. Maybe this model is not doing quite as well, and using those sorts of metrics. So just to wrap up a few key points, really one here is that despite a huge amount of work that's been done on trying to understand water in particular on the landscape, there's still a great deal of challenges, and partly because there's so many uncertainties. Soil is remarkably heterogeneous. The measurements of sort of temperature and moisture in one place, several meters away from another place, are often quite different. It's very difficult to account for averages when there's so much heterogeneity in systems. But another key point here is that there's a remarkable amount of additional information that can be used to make inference about our systems. I've given one here with respect to stable isotope ratios, and I certainly have a particular passion for using that as a tool. But it's really quite a general statement that a variety of different, perhaps non-traditional measurements can be used, other sorts of perhaps chemical traces to infer something about ecosystem exchanges. These are all available. The challenge is, of course, that you need to have an appropriate synthesis mechanism. And this is really where different pieces of technology, meaning both actual real live observational technology, hardware, but also the intellectual infrastructure associated with how you blend information in a modeling framework, an observational framework, how that all comes together is really where putting the pieces together gives you a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And that's really sort of thinking about the hydrologic cycle in this sort of synthesis mode. So I will stop there. And thanks again for everybody coming along. And at this point, I'll hand over to Ashok. I think you'll take the next shot here.
Thank you, David. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see that and hear me okay.
All excellent, Aisha.
Great, thank you. So hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Beryl for inviting me to give this talk, albeit at a very short notice. So I'm going to talk about ozone deposition to oceans, and this might be a different or a bit strange talk compared to what you are used to. I've never attended any TERN talks before, so I'm not sure what the general interest is, but I hope this is of interest to you. So deposition is a process of transfer from the atmosphere to surfaces. So this particular work was done over recent years, and this is part of our ongoing effort to understand and improve physicochemical processes in global climate and earth system models. By doing so, the aim is to reduce uncertainty and improve feedbacks and prediction accuracy of these models. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors from CSIRO, international collaborators, NCI Australia, and Access NRI for their contributions to this work. So what is ozone? So ozone is a greenhouse gas. You have good ozone, you have bad ozone. The stratospheric ozone is termed as a good ozone because it protects us from sun's harmful ultraviolet rays. In the troposphere, which is the lowest 10 to 15 kilometers of the atmosphere, it is considered as bad ozone. Closer to home, it's an air pollutant that impacts human health and plant productivity. Ozone is a secondary gas. It is not emitted directly into the atmosphere, but it is formed by photochemical reactions involving precursor species like oxygen in the stratosphere and oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds in the troposphere. It has been reported that the tropospheric ozone burden has increased by about 40% since pre-industrial times. And you can see the plots on the right-hand side, which show the infrared spectra of various greenhouse gases and the distribution of ozone in the vertical in the atmosphere. This is a plot from IPCC AR6, which shows anthropogenic warming in terms of radiative forcing by various species since pre-industrial times. And you can see that the ozone contribution to the anthropogenic forcing is the third largest, and it is very similar to methane. And 90% of this contribution by ozone is due to the tropospheric component. The rest of it is due to the stratospheric component, which is obviously quite small. Here is a multimodal derived global budget of ozone in the troposphere. There are various components. There's chemical production, chemical loss, stratosphere to troposphere exchange. There is surface dry deposition loss. And then there is atmospheric burden, which is what remains in the atmosphere. So you would see that the deposition to the Earth's surface is an important sink of ozone, about 1,000 teragrams of ozone per year, and about 30% of it is to the ocean. It has been reported that deposition to water has the largest uncertainty compared to all other surfaces. So in terms of modeling deposition, it is usually calculated from ozone flux, which is parameterized in terms of deposition velocity. So most global climate chemistry and Earth system models, chemical transport models, they make simplistic assumptions to describe oceanic deposition of ozone. For example, we have used Access UKCA here, which is an Australian climate chemistry model, which is a version of the Access climate model here in Australia. And you can see that if we compare the ozone deposition velocity to the ocean derived by this particular model with observations, so this is the plot on the bottom right, you see that the model results don't compare well with cruise-based ozone flux measurements. And these are the only ozone flux measurements we have so far over the open ocean. So there is a large overprediction by the model of the deposition velocity to the ocean, and it is by a factor of 2 to 4. And this is typical of all models. This is not just Access UKCA. So obviously there are gaps in our understanding of the deposition process. So what we have done here, and this work has been done over the last few years, we have tried to improve ozone deposition to the ocean in models. So we have done an investigation, and what we found is that these models, they ignore important waterside physicochemical processes. And this is not, so these are not ignored deliberately. It's because there's a lack of mathematical framework to actually include these processes appropriately. And some of the processes that are important for ozone deposition to the ocean are listed here. Solubility of ozone in water, chemical reaction of ozone with dissolved iodide, molecular diffusion, turbulent mixing, and all these processes happen in top few millimeters of the water layer. And on the right-hand side, I've given a diagram which shows all these layers in water. So what we have done, and I'm not going to describe it too much here, except to say that we have developed a new mathematical scheme for ozone deposition velocity and hence the ozone deposition flux to the ocean that includes all these processes that I have listed up here. So when we use this new scheme and compare the derived or the modeled ozone deposition velocity with the observations, we see that there's a considerable improvement with the new scheme. And this is the right-hand plot here. The left-hand plot is the old plot with the old scheme. So when we put this scheme into our global model, what impact does it have on the global deposition of ozone to the ocean? So what we see is that the ozone deposition to the ocean is reduced by 65%, which is quite a lot over the current estimates. And what impact does it have on the surface ozone concentration globally? So the right-hand plot here, which is the difference plot, you can see that the surface ozone increases almost everywhere when you use the new scheme in the Access UKCA chemistry climate model. And you see that there are increases by up to 16% in the mid to high latitudes in the southern hemisphere. With the new scheme, we also see that the model actually describes observed ozone concentration better compared to the old scheme. And an example of this is these two scatter plots on the right-hand side, which you can see. And these are observations from the Canuck Cape Green monitoring station in Tasmania. So the middle one is the scatter plot with the old scheme, and the bottom one is the scatter plot with the new scheme. So there's a significant improvement in the surface concentration of ozone. Now, because the ozone concentration increases, there's an impact on radiative forcing as well. So there's a warming impact because of this change in ozone concentration. And we have quantified that as well, and this is given in this particular paper. So the concluding remarks, so the new oceanic ozone deposition formulation that we have developed, and it's reported in the literature, it shows that the ocean absorbs far less ozone than we thought, about 65% less, leading to higher surface ozone and stronger climate warming effects. This work, this particular scheme that we have developed is also being used by other groups internationally in well-known models. One thing I would like to emphasize here is that we are severely lacking ozone flux measurements, and Gab mentioned flux measurements there. And I would like to say that if someone can actually measure these fluxes over the open ocean, which would add tremendously to what we already have in terms of measurements. And that would be a great contribution to our understanding of surface ozone processes over the ocean, and in understanding and improving physicochemical processes and parameters in these global models as well as regional models. Thank you. And I would like to hand over to Claire now.
Yes, hello everybody. Just need to share my screen. Hopefully that's working. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, so I guess I'm finishing off also talking about fluxes. I think Gabe started explaining why it's really important to understand all the different parts of the system. And, you know, David talked about water fluxes from the land to the atmosphere, and then Ashok talked about fluxes of ozone from the atmosphere to the ocean. And I'm going to talk about fluxes of chemicals called biogenic volatile organic chemicals from the land to the atmosphere. And I have a nice picture here, hopefully you can see, of a beautiful scribbly gum, one of my favorite trees. And I'm really talking about these chemicals that you might notice when you walk in the forest. You get a nice smell of a bunch of these different chemicals. They're actually quite important in atmospheric chemistry. So I'm going to want to acknowledge a bunch of co-authors here for this particular part. There were a lot more people involved in this campaign, which was the Koala 2020 campaign. That campaign was run on unceded Darawal country, which is where I'm speaking from myself today. So why do we care about these compounds? So these compounds are emitted by trees, and as Ashok mentioned, you know, they are part of the chemistry that creates tropospheric ozone, but they can also condense and cause a new particle formation. And that this new particle formation, they can grow into particles that can seed clouds and therefore rain. So there's a big feedback mechanism that's quite important. And they can also, because they create particles and ozone, they're also important for air quality. So I'm going to talk about a campaign called Koala 2020. That stands for Characterising Organics and Aerosol Loading in Australia. It happened between the middle of January 2020 and March 2020 at the Cataract Scout Camp, which is kind of located a little bit to the southwest of Sydney. You can see it on the map here. There was a large quantity of different things that happened in this campaign. The main campaign was ambient chemical composition measurements, but we also had some soil measurements and some tree measurements. So this is like an aerial shot from a drone. This is the main scribbly gun that I'm going to be talking about later. Here we have an air quality monitoring station that was deployed by the DQ people. We had Airbox, which is a community aerosol and atmospheric chemistry lab. And we had this was a clean lab for filter analysis. And then inside this particular laboratory, we had an instrument called a proton transfer mass spectrometer, which can measure these biogenic volatile organics. So I'm just going to show you some pretty pictures now about the campaign. This is the air quality monitoring station being delivered. It actually came in December 2019. It measures a bunch of different air quality components, including the NOx and particulates. Airbox came in the middle of January, thanks to the people at CSIRO. Because we didn't have a flux tower, we had to set up our own mast. So this is the mast going up, a 10-meter mast from which we were sampling the biogenics in the atmosphere. So this is Ashok Moat, who came from Georgia Tech with his PTRMS TOF and installed it in here. This is a bunch of the chemicals that I'm talking about that this instrument can measure. These instruments are complicated. Sometimes they don't work very well. This is a picture of my colleague Travis helping fix some of the problems we have with the instrument. But I thought I'd show this slide because it shows you the inside of the instrument to give you an idea. And the scribbly gum is sitting outside so that we can actually basically put the sample tube out and actually make a direct measurement of what's coming off of the leads. So also we had some colleagues from Nagoya University who made a lot of measurements of the aerosols on filters. And we had some measurements that we made of emissions of NOx from the soils as well, with some colleagues at the University of Lancaster. And we also made measurements, and this is like a supplementary to what I'm mainly going to be talking about. We made measurements using the tubes, and basically this is the chamber that we would put a branch into, so that you wrap the branch into this chamber, and then you're pumping air at a known rate through the chamber. It's 12 liters a minute, and in this instance we're actually sampling onto a tube which we can measure back in the lab later, and you can measure a whole bunch of different chemicals. Sadly, our the main aim for this campaign was to measure these biogenic emissions. Obviously, it coincided with the Black Summer fires, and the first half of the campaign, we were measuring smoke in the atmosphere and anything that we might have wanted to know about what the trees emit when they're not on fire was really swamped by the smoke that we were all sitting in. But we had some big rains in February, and it all cleared up. And at the end of the campaign, we were racing to finish up before the end of the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown in New South Wales. Luckily, we managed in the last 3 days to get the final experiment that we were planning to do, which was on the scribbly gum, which is what I would like to talk about. So they're beautiful trees. Here's the lab coming in. We got them to park it up as close as they could to the scribbly gum. This is it. This is the tree before we parked the laboratory next to it. And so what we did with this experiment, we used those chambers I was just talking about. We wrapped a branch inside it. Here is a little sensor that measures photosynthetic active radiation, or PAR. Inside here, we have like a thermocouple, so we can measure the temperature that the leaves are at inside the chamber, and we're also measuring ambient temperature. So we had a cycle where we were running 10 minutes at a time. We were running either from this chamber up the mast or into an open set of leaves, so that we could check that the chemical composition was not different within the chamber than it was outside. And then basically we ran 3 different branches for pretty much a whole day, so whole day and night, so that we could see how that varied as the light that was falling on it varied and as the temperature varied. So here's the second branch that we ran, and just noticed that the leaves here, it's got a lot of younger leaves in this particular branch. This was also run for about 24 hours. And finally, the third branch was run just before we had to pack up for lockdown. So we can then calculate basically by subtracting the ambient concentrations that we got from up the mast from what we measured into the in the chamber, and then that tells us an enhancement above the background that we're getting in the chamber. We know the amount that we're pumping, so we can work out basically the micrograms of the different chemicals that are being released per hour, and then we can display that either as a normalized by the leaf area for the branch that we had, or by the weight of the leaves. So in this instance, I'm showing here isoprene, and we're looking at the milligrams per centimeter squared of leaf area per hour. And this is like basically 3 days of measurements. This is when we're measuring the first branch, when we're measuring the second branch, and when we're measuring the third branch. And I've plotted above the photosynthetic the photosynthetically active radiation, the PAR, and you can see that as the clouds go in and out, that changes in the day, it peaks in the middle of the day, and that drops out to nothing when the sun sets. We had a much sunnier day on this first day, and you can see the isoprene emissions are larger. We had a less sunny day on the second day with much lower isoprene emissions, and then we also had like a cloudier day on the third day. But we have more significant, certainly quite a lot more significant isoprene emitted than we had on the second day. So I've also plotted that, what else we wanted to know, which is the temperature in the chamber, and the temperature in the chamber went up, peaked up almost at 50 degrees, and was less on the second day and a little bit higher on the third day. So obviously it looks like something different is happening on this second day. Yes, the temperature is lower, and so is the PAR, but maybe not enough to explain it. And really, we think that these lighter colored leaves are actually emitting quite a lot less isoprene than the more mature leaves. And to just kind of plot that, this plot is showing the isoprene emitted per leaf area in the leaf area against the PAR, and it's kind of definitely some sort of exponential looking relationship, and then I've colored it by temperature. So there's two factors seem to be happening here, but it's sensitive both to the PAR and to the temperature. And this is like the same idea, but instead of isoprene, it's monoterpenes. We can see also we're getting a strong relationship between the two. So still quite a lot of work to model that up, but just to summarize the emission rates, we've measured these emission rates of these biogenic VOCs, and they've been calculated with respect to the leaf area and the dry weight of the branch. We found significantly lower emission rates from the branch when the fresh young leaves than from the more mature leaves. And the emissions increase with increased PAR and increased temperature, but we need to decouple those and model it. And what we're really trying to aim for in the long run with this is a better understanding of these climate feedbacks, because as the temperature increases, these BVOCs are going to increase, which is going to increase the new particle formation. It's going to increase the ozone and therefore potentially increase cloudiness. So there's a feedback there that we are trying to understand. So that is me, and I'm going to hand back to Beryl.
Wow, thanks, Claire. So, Claire, there's a whole new perspective of going down to the forest today and breathing deeply all the forest perfumes and things like that. You could be robbing the atmosphere of some valuable volatiles. Is that right?
Certainly, yes. It's a nice smell when you go for a walk in the forest, and I don't think about them the same as before. I've even heard people who think that the trees communicate with each other via these emitting these chemicals, and certainly they emit a very large amount more when they're under stress. So, like cut grass or cut leaves when, they'll emit a lot, but as a stress mechanism. But
Yeah, I don't think when people think of atmospheric chemistry that they recognise that so much of it is actually coming off the surface or the ocean in case of lake thing. I've got a question. So, Gab, there was a question about flux towers. And I'm just wondering, do you think that we've got enough flux towers in Australia and around the world to do the job for the modelling that you talked about?
It obviously depends on what for, but for our purposes, obviously, we have, I don't know how many you have, sort of 20, 30, maybe 40 altogether in Australia, which would sound like pretty low spatial coverage. I answered this question for Georgie as well. But what changes that a little bit is that because the temporal frequency of the measurements is so high, we actually cover quite, the breadth of weather that one place experiences is quite a lot. And so if you map the weather experienced at one place across 40 locations, we cover quite a lot of the joint distribution over the country. But most of the space is covered probably, but more is always welcome. And that's true both in Australia and internationally, I would argue. And I'm sure that's true for the other panelists as well, for the things they're doing. We always want more measurements because, this game we've been playing with machine learning that I mentioned, Beryl, really has only come about because of the volume of flux tower data we now finally have. When I did my PhD some time ago, it wasn't too long ago, I assure you, we really didn't have enough. We're just starting to get enough flux tower data to start thinking, well, maybe we could actually empirically model it rather than just having our mechanistic models. And that's really changed now. So machine learning can tell us a lot about our models because we have so much data, and hopefully that will just continue to grow.
And Aishal, you mentioned that you wouldn't mind a few flux towers out on the ocean. Are there any there?
Yeah, so the ones that I presented, they are the only ones, as far as I know, which were taken in 2012, I think, or reported in 2012. And there hasn't been anything since then. And that too, those were sort of around South America, North America, a few segments there. So we don't actually know how those ozone fluxes vary with the latitude, longitude. And as you saw, there are so many fluctuations in those data as well. So to reduce that uncertainty and cover, bigger area, we certainly need a lot more flux measurements. And I think it's not easy, to do ozone flux measurements, perhaps compared to other species, and that too on the ocean, open ocean. So there are probably some problems there to do with logistics and instrumentation.
Yeah. And David, you seem to be, it was music to my ears, but if I got it correct, but you seem to be saying that we need to do things at the ecosystem or larger type scale, and we need the intersection of the organisations such as TERN doing the gathering the data and the access, NRI, which is doing the climate simulations, and other organisations. So you're really into the macro scale of things. Is this something that is really emerging in the fields that you're in?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, one of the things is I find really fortunate actually about working in sort of this stable isotope space is that that's the common language that I use as the science, but it has little tendrils into all sorts of different communities. That once upon a time I called myself a climate modeler, well and truly, but we've done work in remote sensing and field-based research as well. And so I think that's where there is what I see is this real opportunity to think about ways that the investments in national science infrastructure can really come together. And I think Gab, mentioned an aspect of this too, having some of the TERN data delivered in a way that's easy for climate modelers to use, and so too climate model outputs developed in a way or output in a way that makes it easy for an ecosystem scientist to pick up and use, that the experts should be thinking about the ways in which they can package their data that makes it easy for others to use within that sort of collected science program, in a way that it's all of the pieces, everybody is working on their details, but the real synthesis and the real gains come when we see how we can all work together around these common goals, which could mean something to do with our data infrastructure, our computing infrastructure, but also the technical resources that are in place to support key instrumentation programs, including TERN for that matter, as well as the modeling side as well. I think the other thing that I'll just note quite briefly is that that in Australia, the emerging remote sensing capabilities through an in-country space program is a great area where there could be also developments with partners around the world as well. Both government and private operations in space can provide new sorts of information. And, I certainly have my favorite pet projects and pet things that I'd imagine I'd like to measure from space, but there are things that could be done here domestically that's integrated with our science infrastructure.
Great. You should be a champion for TERN when we go for funding. Claire, you may have to help me answer the question that Melita's put into the chat, because she's saying, should the sort of things that you're doing, being the atmospheric chemistry measurements such as you described, should they be part of our national research infrastructure that TERN does? But what you were doing was part of a global campaign, but is it the sort of thing, so TERN is there to provide infrastructure at scale, which is beyond the capacity of a normal institution or individual? Would you say that the work that you're doing fits into that category?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's expensive, but it can be done. And you wouldn't be able to fit out every single one of your towers. But, the campaign that I ran was run on, and I should have acknowledged it and I forgot to. It was a National Environmental Science Programme, a Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub that funded this research. It was funded with very little money, really. And basically all the international collaborators who came were just invited through IGAC. We advertised that we wanted to do this, and the people came because they were interested. So yeah, we didn't have much money, but they have in Finland, they have one of these PTRMS TOFs on the top of the tower and one at the bottom, and then they're doing flux measurements all the way up the tower. So people, if you invest the money, yes, you can do it. It's perfectly feasible, but it needs money basically, and people, because the instruments are expensive, but keeping them running well and interpreting the data, that's also expensive. So it would need a big investment. And yeah.
Well, think about it. Thank you very much for that, Claire. And thank you, speakers, and also for the people that put their questions in the Q&A, and for our speakers who answered them on the run. It's been great having your company, and we have one more webinar left for the year where we figured that we're going to be into summer by then, and it might be good to be thinking about extreme heat and applying environmental data to predicting our health. So do join us for that one. And I will now say goodbye to you all and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you. Oops.